It began as a whisper, the kind that threads through palace corridors like a draft too secret to be felt, only sensed. A cassette tape tucked inside a silk-lined jewelry box, its ribbon wound tight with confession and pain. Diana had recorded it not for revenge, but for survival. A fragile truth trapped in magnetic coils. In that recording, her voice trembled with grace and defiance, confronting the woman who had haunted her marriage, her nights, her every photograph. Camilla's replies were calm, almost tender, as if soothing a ghost that refused to fade. What neither woman knew was that this single exchange, buried for years, would one day echo beyond gilded walls, a private reckoning poised to shatter the monarchy's polished silence. And when the words finally surfaced, the crown would never sound the same again. The night Diana chose to record was still and cruel. The housekeeper had retired. Even the clock seemed hesitant to tick. She spoke softly, not to be heard, only to be remembered. "You know what it feels like," she whispered into the machine, "to be the third person in your own marriage." The pause that followed was long enough to feel like a century. Across the city, Camilla lifted her phone, sensing something inevitable. Their voices, though separated by walls and distance, met in a strange intimacy of truth. Not rivals now, but two women tethered by a man and a crown. When the red light on the recorder flickered out, Diana exhaled, as if releasing years of invisible bruises. Morning came with the faint hum of helicopters over Kensington. The tabloids were already circling like carrion. Diana hid the tape beneath her son's old storybooks, a mother's instinct meeting a spy's precision. But within days, a trusted aide noticed something amiss. A phone line tapped. A courier followed. The monarchy, ever watchful, began to sniff the scent of scandal long before it reached the press. Diana, aware of their surveillance, smiled to herself in the mirror. "Let them listen," she murmured. "Maybe this time, they'll hear." Camilla received a letter that week, unsigned, sealed with royal wax. Inside was a single line. "They know." Her hand trembled as she read it, the tea cooling beside her untouched. That evening she lit a fire, feeding it with letters written in Charles' hand. Yet one line stayed with her. Diana's voice, recorded and replayed in her mind, saying softly, "We could have been friends." Camilla stared into the flames, realizing that confession was both dagger and mercy. By Sunday, the palace hum had changed. Courtiers spoke in riddles. Phones rang, then stopped. Somewhere deep inside the archives, a duplicate of Diana's tape had already been made. The Queen's private secretary was instructed to contain the noise. But the noise, once born, had found wings. Outside, the world continued. Children playing, guards changing, unaware that within those royal walls the seeds of a storm had begun to root. A whisper that would, in time, become a scream. A week later, the sound of betrayal found its way to Fleet Street. In a quiet corner office at the Sunday Chronicle, an unmarked envelope landed on the desk of investigative journalist Eleanor Ward. Inside, a single cassette tape, unlabeled but unmistakably royal. When she pressed play, the static gave way to Diana's trembling voice, elegant, wounded, and fearless. Eleanor froze. Every instinct screamed that this was dynamite wrapped in silk, but someone else was already watching. Across the Thames, a man in a tailored suit dialed a number linked to the palace's communications office. What had begun as a secret between two women was about to become a war between truth and silence. That same evening, Camilla received a call she wished she hadn't. "It's out," whispered a male voice before the line went dead. She stood still, clutching the receiver as though holding back the world itself. Across London, Diana sat alone in her drawing room, sensing the ripple before it reached her. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of what she had unleashed. Not vengeance, something quieter, deeper. Truth, finally spoken aloud. Yet truth, once freed, knows no loyalty. Somewhere within Buckingham's marble halls, doors began to close, and secrets began to sprint. By dawn, the palace was in lockdown. Advisors whispered about containment. The Queen's private secretary summoned Charles, who arrived pale and furious. She wouldn't, he insisted. But even he didn't sound convinced. The Queen listened in silence, her face a mask carved from centuries of composure. "If it's true," she said finally, "then silence will not protect us. We must control the narrative." But outside, the narrative was already writing itself. Somewhere in a newsroom, the tape had been copied. Somewhere else, someone was already pressing play again. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She played the recording again and again, each word a revelation, each pause a wound. "We were 3 in this marriage," Diana's voice said, the same phrase that would one day define her legacy. Eleanor realized she held not just a story, but history. She drafted her article in silence, her fingers trembling over the keys. "Clusive, the secret voice of a princess." She hesitated, then deleted the headline. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about humanity, heartbreak, and the quiet rebellion of a woman no one had truly heard. When the palace awoke the next morning, the storm had arrived. A courier dropped the Sunday Chronicle on the doorstep of Kensington Palace. Diana, wrapped in her robe, picked it up quietly. There, beneath a single headline, "Don't tell anyone." Her words stared back at her. She sank into a chair, the world suddenly too loud, too bright. Somewhere across town, Camilla read the same page, her tea untouched, her lips pressed into silence. And in Buckingham, the Queen folded the paper, her eyes unblinking. The recording had spoken. The monarchy, for the first time in generations, had been forced to listen. Buckingham Palace had always been built on silence, a fortress of control disguised as grace. But silence now felt like surrender. The Queen gathered her most trusted advisors for a meeting behind closed doors. The air was sharp, the mood brittle. "We do not react," she said, voice cold as silver. "We reassert." Yet even as she spoke, the damage was spreading. In the streets, the people whispered of betrayal and courage, of love turned into war. Within the palace, phones rang without answers. And above it all, Diana's voice, calm, intimate, defiant, looped endlessly in minds that once believed her powerless. Charles left the meeting in silence, his mind a battlefield of guilt and anger. Every headline was a mirror reflecting his choices. He phoned Camilla, but she didn't answer, perhaps knowing no words could undo what had been unleashed. Alone in his study, Charles poured a drink and stared at the wall of family portraits, the weight of royal heritage pressing against his chest. Somewhere between duty and desire, he realized how completely he had lost control. The crown had become a cage, and the world had found its key. Camilla, meanwhile, had retreated to Raymill House, her sanctuary of solitude. Reporters camped at her gate like vultures waiting for movement. She refused to speak. For hours she paced the floor, listening to the muffled hum of news broadcasts beyond the walls. When she finally looked out, flashes from camera bulbs exploded against her window like distant lightning. "You wanted honesty," she murmured to herself. "Now the whole world has it." Somewhere deep within her, pity for Diana began to stir, or perhaps pity for herself, trapped in the same merciless storm. For Diana, the reaction was electric. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace with flowers and handwritten letters. They called her brave, their princess of truth. But inside those stone walls, she felt the chill of isolation sharpen. Every phone call from the palace came with a warning. Keep silent, do not provoke. Yet her heart, once broken, now pulsed with conviction. She had spoken once. Now she would be heard. "If honesty is rebellion," she told a close friend, "then I suppose I've started a revolution." That night, as London glittered beneath a restless sky, the monarchy met in shadow. Statements were drafted, denials rehearsed. But the truth was no longer theirs to manage. It lived in every newspaper, every whispered conversation, every photograph of Diana's weary grace. The Queen understood this better than anyone. "History has its own pen," she said to her secretary, "and it writes in ink we cannot erase." Outside, the bells of Westminster tolled midnight, marking not just the end of a day, but the beginning of a reckoning. The palace no longer whispered, it plotted. In hidden rooms scented with old books and polished brass, the crown's machinery began to move. A discreet team of media advisors was assembled to reshape the narrative. Words like discredit, containment, and dignity floated through the air like invisible blades. Diana's truth had ignited sympathy. Now it had to be cooled. Across the Thames, phone calls were made, articles commissioned, favors invoked. It wasn't vengeance, it was strategy. Yet, even among the courtiers, a question lingered. How do you bury a voice that refuses to die? By morning, the headlines began to shift. Rumors whispered of emotional instability, of private despair, painting Diana not as a hero but as a fragile figure of pity. The plan was working, almost. Diana saw through it at once. She called her friend and confidante, Simone, telling her, "They want to rewrite me before I'm even gone." Simone's silence said everything. In the background, the television played a commentator's voice dissecting Diana's words, her tone clinical, detached. Diana turned it off. "They can have their story," she said quietly, "but I'll keep my truth." Camilla watched the spectacle unfold from behind closed curtains. The public sympathy for Diana stirred unease, not because she envied it, but because she recognized its power. "They'll come for you next," a friend warned over lunch. Camilla smiled faintly. "They already have." Yet in that weary half smile lived something unspoken. A strange, begrudging respect. Diana had done what none of them dared. She had broken the golden code of silence. Camilla wondered if, in another life, they might have been allies instead of adversaries in a kingdom built on pretense. In the palace's press office, a decision was made. If Diana wished to speak through tapes, then the monarchy would speak through image. A new photograph of the Queen, serene, resolute, was released to the press. Behind every pixel lay intent, calm, control, continuity. The message was clear. The crown endures. Yet, as the public stared at that perfect image, the truth beneath it trembled. A quiet war of perception that no crown could truly win. Behind the curtains, even the Queen felt the weight of what could not be undone. That night, Diana stood before her mirror once more, the same place where it had all begun. The city hummed outside, unaware that another recording had started. Her voice was steadier now, her words deliberate. "They think silence is strength. I think it's fear." She spoke not to expose, but to reclaim. The tape would remain hidden for now, but one day it would be heard. Somewhere, thunder rolled across the Thames, echoing through the city like a promise. The War of Shadows had begun. And this time, Diana was ready. By autumn, the royal facade had begun to crack. Every smile looked rehearsed, every handshake choreographed. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere was electric with accusation. Charles and Camilla, once bound by secrecy, now found themselves at odds. "They're turning you into the villain," she warned him over brandy. "Perhaps I already am," he replied. The press had grown merciless, dissecting every word, every glance. The crown demanded unity, but what remained was exhaustion. Two people caught between duty and desire, and a woman's voice still haunting every corridor of the palace. In Buckingham Palace, the Queen met with her eldest son in private. The conversation was not shouted, it was sharpened. "This cannot continue," she said, her tone colder than any reprimand. "You are not just a man, Charles. You are the future." He stared at her, the weight of expectation suffocating. "And what if the future no longer wants me?" he asked quietly. For the first time, she had no reply. The monarchy could contain scandal, but it could not contain decay, especially when it came from within. Meanwhile, Diana prepared for a public engagement at a children's hospital. Cameras followed her every move, hoping for a crack in her composure. But instead of bitterness, the world saw grace. She bent to a young patient's bedside and whispered something that made him laugh, a sound purer than any headline. For all the palace's efforts to silence her, her humanity spoke louder. Outside, a reporter shouted, "Do you regret what you said?" She turned, her smile soft and knowing. "Truth doesn't need regret," she replied, and walked on. Camilla, watching the coverage from home, felt the sting of contrast. Public affection for Diana grew by the hour, while her own reputation was reduced to whispers and caricature. "You'll never win against a ghost," a friend told her. "She's not a ghost," Camilla answered quietly. "She's the truth they refuse to hear." But late that night, as she poured herself another drink, she caught her reflection and saw the same loneliness Diana had spoken of. Different woman, same cage. The realization settled like ash. Then came the second tape. A journalist, the same one who first broke the story, received a call from an anonymous source. "There's more." She recorded everything. This time, it wasn't a conversation. It was a monologue. Diana's raw, unfiltered truth. Her fears, her betrayals, her defiance. The journalist's hands trembled as she listened. It was no longer a scandal. It was a confession that carried the weight of an empire. And as the first words echoed through the newsroom, the countdown to royal reckoning began anew. The world awoke to the sound of truth. At dawn, radio stations across Britain began playing excerpts from the second tape. Diana's unguarded voice, trembling yet unbroken. She spoke of loneliness, manipulation, and the silent wars behind palace gates. There was no bitterness, only honesty stripped bare. Within hours, every paper in London carried the same quote. They wanted obedience. I chose freedom. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace again, not to mourn, but to listen. For the first time, her pain belonged not to the royals, but to the people. Buckingham was in chaos. Aides rushed through hallways carrying papers marked "Crisis Containment." Charles stormed from one room to another, furious at how powerless he had become. "Who gave it to them?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the chamber. "It doesn't matter," the Queen replied coolly. "It's done." Her calm unnerved him more than her anger. For the first time, he saw in her eyes not control, but calculation. Somewhere behind that composure, the monarch was already planning her next move. The broadcast reached Camilla in Wiltshire. She didn't need to hear much, just a few words. "I loved, and I was not loved in return." Diana's voice cracked mid-sentence, and for a moment, Camilla felt her own defenses crumble. She turned off the radio, her pulse quickening. The woman she once resented had become untouchable, not through power, but through vulnerability. That realization terrified her. History would not remember sides. It would remember suffering. And both of them had suffered more than anyone would ever truly know. The public turned from curiosity to outrage. For the first time, sympathy shifted from royalty to humanity. Outside the palace gates, people left notes not for a princess, but for a woman wronged. The monarchy's image, once untouchable, began to fracture. Within the palace, advisors urged a televised address, something to reclaim control. But the queen refused. To answer her, she said, is to admit she was right. Silence became their final defense. Yet silence by then sounded like guilt. That night, in the quiet of Kensington Palace, Diana sat before her mirror again. The room felt lighter, freer, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. She held the recorder in her hands, now still. "They can't take it back," she whispered. "It's done." For the first time in years, she smiled. Not out of triumph, but release. Outside, London glittered like 1,000 watching eyes. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben struck midnight. A new chapter of her life, unfiltered and unclaimed, had begun. In the days that followed, Britain stood still. The monarchy, once an unshakable symbol, now trembled under the weight of revelation. In pubs, on buses, and across dinner tables, the same question echoed. How could they have silenced her for so long? The Queen watched it unfold with quiet resignation. "We survive storms," she told her staff, "but not the truth within them." The line between duty and humanity had blurred, and though the palace still glimmered in morning light, a shadow now lived permanently on its walls. The shape of a voice that refused to fade. Charles avoided the cameras. His aides begged him to appear, smile, wave, speak. But every gesture felt hollow. Alone at Highgrove, he listened once more to the recording, to the woman whose heart he had never truly understood. Her words cut deeper than any scandal. "You can't love someone into obedience," she'd said. In that moment, remorse replaced anger. He realized the tragedy wasn't what she had done. It was what he hadn't. Outside, the wind tore through the garden, scattering the roses she once admired. Camilla found no solace in victory or defeat. She became a recluse for a time, tired of being the villain in a story that no longer felt hers. Late at night, she reread Diana's old interviews. Her tone softer now, less defensive. Somewhere between those lines, she saw fragments of herself. Another woman devoured by the same machine of appearances. "Perhaps," she whispered into the quiet, "we were both casualties of the same war." The admission brought no comfort, but it brought truth. And that was something the Crown had never freely given. For the public, Diana's words became legend. The tapes circulated across continents, studied, quoted, immortalized. But within Britain, they became something sacred. Proof that even within the highest walls, humanity could still speak. Children born long after her death would grow up hearing her voice, not as a scandal, but as a testament. And the monarchy, though enduring, would never sound quite the same. The crown remained intact, yes, but its silence had been broken forever. History had been rewritten not by decree, but by a whisper on tape. Years later, inside the quiet archives of Windsor, a curator catalogued a small silver recorder labeled "Private." He placed it gently into a glass case, unaware of the tremors it had once caused. Somewhere beyond the castle grounds, bells rang softly in the evening air. History had closed its chapter, but her voice still lingered. Fragile, fearless, eternal. For Diana, the act of speaking had been rebellion. For the world, it became remembrance. And in the end, her truth did what no crown could ever command. It endured.